The Wyoming wind cut through Ruth's threadbare coat like 1,000 knives, each gust carrying the bitter promise of another unforgiving winter. She pulled the worn fabric tighter around her shoulders, though it did little good against the October cold that had already settled deep into the bones of the territory. The vast grassland stretched endlessly before her, golden and brown beneath a sky the color of old pewter. And somewhere beyond those rolling hills lay her last hope for survival. Ruth had walked for 3 days since leaving the last homestead where they'd turned her away. Got no need for another mouth to feed? The rancher's wife had said, not unkindly, but with the firm resolve of someone who'd seen too many lean winters. Ruth couldn't blame her. Times were hard for everyone in 1886, but they were especially hard for a woman alone with no kin to speak for her. The memories of why she was alone still haunted her dreams. The fever had come to their small settlement outside Philadelphia like a thief in the night, stealing breath and life with equal cruelty. First, it had taken her younger brother Samuel, barely 16 and full of dreams about heading west. Then her mother, who'd fought it for 2 weeks before succumbing with Ruth's name on her lips. Her father had lasted longest, his blacksmith's constitution keeping him upright even as the sickness ravaged him from within. But in the end, even his strength hadn't been enough. Ruth had survived. Sometimes in the darkest moments of her journey west, she wondered if that was a blessing or a curse. The town of Cedar Ridge appeared just as the sun began its descent toward the mountains. It wasn't much to look at. A collection of weather-beaten buildings huddled together as if for protection against the endless prairie. The main street was little more than a mud track, frozen now in the evening cold, with wooden sidewalks that had seen better days. She counted a general store, a saloon with tiny piano music drifting from its doors, a small hotel that had seen better days, and what looked like a sheriff's office with a lone horse tied outside. Ruth straightened her spine and smoothed her dark hair, trying to make herself presentable despite the dust and weariness of the road. She'd learned that appearances mattered, especially for a woman seeking respectable employment. Her dress, once a deep blue, had faded to the color of a winter sky, but it was clean and carefully mended. Her hands, though roughened by work, were scrubbed as clean as she could manage with creek water and sand. The general store seemed the best place to start. A bell jangled overhead as she pushed open the door, and the warmth from a pot-bellied stove hit her like a physical embrace. The proprietor, a thin man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose, looked up from his ledger. "Help you, miss?" "I'm looking for work," Ruth said, proud that her voice didn't waver. "Cooking, cleaning, mending, I can do it all. I'm a hard worker, sir, and I don't require much." The man's expression softened slightly, but he shook his head. "Times are lean, miss. I've got my wife to help in the store, and she does all our cooking besides." But he paused, stroking his gray whiskers thoughtfully. "You might try the Morrison Ranch. Heard tell Caleb Morrison's been looking for someone to keep house since his cook up and left last month. Where might I find this ranch?" The storekeeper's face clouded. "It's a fair piece out 15 miles north following the creek. But miss, I should tell you." He glanced around as if worried someone might overhear. "Caleb Morrison's not the friendliest sort. Keeps to himself mostly. There's talk about him, about what happened to his wife and why he lives out there alone like he does. I'm not afraid of hard work or difficult people," Ruth said firmly. "How do I get there?" The man sighed. "Follow the main road north out of town until you hit Willow Creek. Turn west and follow the creek for about 10 miles. You'll see a gate with a Circle M brand. But miss, it'll be full dark before you get there, and the wolves have been bold this year." Ruth's stomach clenched, but she kept her voice steady. "Is there anyone heading that way who might give me a ride? Matter of fact, old Pete's taking supplies out that direction this afternoon. He's loading his wagon behind the saloon. Might be convinced to take you part way, though he won't go all the way to Morrison's place. Nobody much does." Ruth thanked the man and made her way to the saloon. Skirting around to the back where she found a grizzled teamster loading sacks of flour and coffee into a rickety wagon. Pete turned out to be a taciturn but kind enough fellow who agreed to take her as far as the turnoff to the Morrison Ranch. "You sure about this, miss?" he asked as they rattled out of town. His team of mules plodding steadily along the frozen road. "Caleb Morrison ain't exactly known for his hospitality. Man's got a darkness about him ever since." He trailed off, spitting tobacco juice over the side of the wagon. "Since what?" Ruth prompted. Pete was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally he said, "Since his wife died 3 years back now. Comanche raid they say, though some folks whisper it was something else. Either way he's been different since then. Harder. Doesn't come to town much. Doesn't welcome visitors. Last cook. He had lasted all of 2 weeks before heading back east. The sun was hanging low on the horizon when Pete pulled his team to a stop at a barely visible track leading west. "This is as far as I go," he said. "Morrison's place is another 5 miles that way. You'd best hurry if you want to make it before full dark." Ruth climbed down from the wagon, her legs stiff from the cold and the long ride. "Thank you for your kindness, Mr. Pete." He looked at her for a long moment, then reached under his seat and pulled out a battered lantern. "Take this," he said gruffly. "Moon won't be up for hours yet." Ruth accepted the lantern gratefully and set off down the track as Pete's wagon rumbled away. The temperature was dropping fast now that the sun was nearly gone, and her breath came out in white puffs that disappeared into the gathering darkness. The landscape around her was alien and vast, so different from the close, comfortable streets of Philadelphia. Here, the sky seemed to press down with its immensity, and the wind carried sounds she couldn't identify. A coyote's yip in the distance made her walk faster. The 5 miles seemed to stretch forever. Her feet, already sore from days of walking, protested every step. The lantern cast a small circle of yellow light that only seemed to emphasize the darkness beyond. Once she heard something large moving through the sagebrush to her left and froze, heart hammering until whatever it was moved away. Finally, she spotted lights in the distance, the yellow glow of windows that meant warmth and shelter. The Morrison ranch sat in a shallow valley, protected somewhat from the worst of the wind. As she drew closer, Ruth could make out the shape of a 2-story house, solid and unadorned, with a barn and several outbuildings clustered nearby. Everything about the place spoke of function over comfort, of a life pared down to its essentials. She paused at the gate, gathering her courage. The circle and brand was burned into the wooden crosspiece and beyond it. The path to the house was worn smooth by years of use. Taking a deep breath, Ruth lifted the latch and walked through. She had barely made it halfway to the house when the front door opened and a figure emerged, backlit by the warm light from within. Even in silhouette, the man was imposing, tall and broad-shouldered, moving with the easy grace of someone accustomed to physical work. He stopped at the edge of the porch, and Ruth could feel his gaze on her even though she couldn't see his face clearly. "You're on private property," he said. His voice was deep and rough, like gravel grinding under wagon wheels. "Turn around and go back where you came from." Ruth lifted her lantern higher, letting its light fall on her face. "Mr. Morrison, my name is Ruth Caldwell. I heard in town you might be looking for a cook." He was silent for a long moment, and Ruth had the uncomfortable feeling of being measured and weighed when he finally spoke again. His voice held a note of surprise. "You walked here from town partway, mister. Pete gave me a ride to the turnoff. In the dark, I need the work. Mr. Morrison." He stepped down from the porch. And now Ruth could see him more clearly in the lantern light. Caleb Morrison was perhaps 35 with dark hair that needed cutting and a face that might have been handsome if not for the harsh lines etched by sun wind and something deeper. Grief perhaps or anger held too long. His eyes were pale, gray or blue. She couldn't tell in the dim light, but they held a weariness that spoke of a man who'd learned not to trust easily. "Can you actually cook?" he asked bluntly. "Or are you just another Eastern woman thinking she can make biscuits because she once watched her mother do it?" Ruth lifted her chin. "I've been cooking since I was 12 years old. I can make bread from scratch, butcher a chicken, preserve meat, and stretch supplies to last through a lean month. I'm not afraid of hard work. Mr. Morrison." He studied her for another long moment. "Where's your family?" "Dead." The word came out flat and final. "Fever took them all this past spring." Something flickered across his face. Perhaps recognition of a kindred loss. "You have references?" "No, sir. But I'll work the first week for nothing but room and board. If my cooking doesn't suit, I'll leave without complaint." The wind gusted suddenly, cutting through her thin coat, and Ruth couldn't suppress a shiver. Morrison's frown deepened. "Come inside," he said abruptly, turning back toward the house. "We'll discuss terms where it's warm." Ruth followed him up the steps and through the door into blessed warmth. The interior of the house was as spare as its exterior functional furniture, bare walls, everything clean, but with the particular emptiness of a place that hadn't known a woman's touch in years. The main room served as both parlor and dining room with a large stone fireplace taking up one wall through an open doorway. She could glimpse the kitchen. Morrison gestured to a chair near the fire. "Sit. You look half frozen." Ruth sank into the chair gratefully, extending her hands toward the flames. Morrison disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a cup of coffee, black and strong enough to float a horseshoe. "Thank you," she murmured, wrapping her fingers around the warm ceramic. He took a seat across from her, his pale eyes never leaving her face. "Here's my terms," he said without preamble. "Room and board plus $20 a month. You cook 3 meals a day. Keep the kitchen clean. Do the washing once a week. Nothing else. His emphasis on the last 2 words was unmistakable. I don't need conversation. I don't need mothering. And I certainly don't need whatever romantic notions you might have about the West. You cook, I eat. We leave each other alone otherwise. That clear? Perfectly clear, Mr. Morrison. Good. Your room's upstairs. Second door on the right. Kitchen's through there. I eat breakfast at 5, dinner at noon, supper at 6 o'clock. Don't be late with the meals. He stood abruptly. I'll be in the barn. There's stew on the stove if you're hungry. He grabbed his coat and hat from a peg by the door and left without another word. Ruth sat for a moment, listening to his footsteps fade away, then rose to explore her new domain. The kitchen was well equipped, if basic. A large cast iron stove dominated one wall, with shelves of supplies ranged along another. She found flour, coffee, beans, salt, pork, and other staples, enough to work with, though she'd need to be creative. The stew Morrison had mentioned sat in a pot on the back of the stove, and one taste told her why he needed a cook. It was edible, barely, but had all the flavor of boiled leather. Ruth climbed the stairs to find her room carrying the lantern Morrison had left. The second door on the right opened to reveal a small but clean space with a narrow bed, a wash stand, and a single window looking out over the dark prairie. Someone, Morrison himself, presumably had laid a fire in the small fireplace, and Ruth quickly got it going. As she unpacked her few belongings, Ruth could hear the wind howling outside, punctuated occasionally by the distant howl of wolves. The sound sent a shiver down her spine. But there was something else too. A sense of having found safe harbor, however temporary. She had work. She had shelter. And for now that was enough. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. She'd have to prove herself in the kitchen, learn Morrison's preferences, navigate his moods. But tonight, for the first time in months, Ruth Caldwell had a roof over her head and the promise of purpose come morning. As she prepared for bed, she thought about the man who'd hired her. Caleb Morrison was clearly a man carrying heavy burdens, someone who'd built walls around himself as surely as he'd built this house in the middle of nowhere. His warning had been clear. He wanted to cook, nothing more. But Ruth had glimpsed something in his eyes when she'd mentioned her family's death. A flicker of understanding that suggested his own walls might not be as impenetrable as he believed. She'd respect his wishes. Of course, she needed this job too badly to risk it with unwanted familiarity. But as she blew out the lantern and settled into bed, listening to the wild sounds of the Wyoming night, Ruth couldn't help but wonder about the story behind Caleb Morrison's solitude, and what had driven him to seek isolation in this beautiful, terrible land. Ruth woke in the pre-dawn darkness to the sound of wind rattling the window panes. For a moment she couldn't remember where she was. Then the events of the previous day came flooding back. The Morrison Ranch. Her new position, the Tastern man who'd hired her with strict conditions. She dressed quickly in the cold room, her fingers fumbling with buttons in the dark. The house was silent as a tomb as she made her way downstairs, careful to avoid the creaking steps she'd noticed the night before. In the kitchen, she lit the oil lamp and surveyed her domain properly for the first time. The stove was cold, and she realized with a start that she'd need to fetch wood from outside, wrapping her shawl tightly around her shoulders. Ruth stepped out the back door into the bitter morning air. The wood pile was covered with a light dusting of frost that sparkled in the starlight. As she gathered an armful of split logs, she heard the lowing of cattle in the distance and the neigh of horses from the barn. Back inside, she got the fire going and set water to boil. Breakfast for a working man needed to be substantial. She'd learned that much from cooking for her father. She found bacon in the cold lard, eggs in a basket, and set about making biscuits from scratch. The familiar rhythm of cooking soothed her nerves, and by the time she heard Morrison's boots on the porch, she had everything ready. He entered without knocking. It was his house, after all, bringing with him the scent of hay and horses. His gray eyes swept over the laden table, bacon crisp, but not burned, eggs fried with the yolk still soft, biscuits golden brown, and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. "Morning, Mr. Morrison," Ruth said quietly, pouring his coffee. He nodded once and sat down, eating with the focused efficiency of a man who viewed meals as fuel rather than pleasure. Ruth busied herself at the stove, trying not to watch him, but she couldn't help noticing the way he paused after the first bite of biscuit, a flicker of surprise crossing his weathered features. "These will do," he said finally, which Ruth took as high praise. He finished his meal in silence, then stood and reached for his hat. "I'll be working the north pasture today. Dinner at noon sharp." After he left, Ruth cleaned up and began exploring the kitchen more thoroughly. The pantry was well stocked, but monotonous. Beans, salt, pork, flour, coffee, dried apples, and precious little else. She'd have to get creative to provide any variety. There was a kitchen garden out back, she discovered, but it had clearly been neglected. The few hardy vegetables that had survived, potatoes, turnips, and onions, were nearly choked by weeds. The morning flew by as she prepared the noon meal and set bread dough to rise. She'd found a hunch of venison in the cold room and decided to make a proper stew, seasoning it with wild herbs she'd spotted growing near the kitchen door. When Morrison returned at exactly noon, the kitchen was filled with savory aromas. This time he actually paused in the doorway, his nostrils flaring slightly. "Smells different," he said, which was the closest thing to a compliment she'd gotten. As he ate, Ruth noticed him glancing around the kitchen. She'd cleaned as she cooked, and the surfaces gleamed in a way they probably hadn't in months. The windows, freed of their layer of grime, let in streams of autumn sunlight. "The garden out back," she ventured carefully. "Would you mind if I worked on it? Come spring we could have fresh vegetables." He looked up sharply and she worried she'd overstepped. But after a moment he nodded. "Do what you want with it. Just don't expect me to help." That afternoon, while bread baked in the oven, Ruth attacked the garden with a vengeance. The physical work felt good after months of uncertainty and travel. She pulled weeds, turned soil, and salvaged what vegetables she could. The sun was warm on her back, and for the first time in months she found herself humming. She didn't notice Morrison watching from the barn door, or see the peculiar expression that crossed his face at the sound of music in his silent domain. The days fell into a pattern. Ruth rose before dawn, prepared breakfast, cleaned, cooked, tended the garden, and retired early. Morrison ate her meals with apparent approval, but few words. He was gone most of each day, working cattle, mending fences, doing the 1,000 tasks that kept a ranch running. In the evenings, he would sit by the fire cleaning his guns, or mending tack while Ruth worked on the mending she'd found piled in a basket. It was a lonely existence, but Ruth had grown accustomed to loneliness. Sometimes, lying in her narrow bed, she could hear Morrison moving about downstairs, the creak of his chair, the clink of a glass. Once very late, she thought she heard him speaking to someone, his voice low and urgent. But when she crept to the top of the stairs, she realized he was alone, talking to shadows or memories. The first week passed, then the second. The weather grew colder, and Ruth learned to keep the fires burning constantly. She learned Morrison's preferences without asking. His eggs over easy, his coffee black, his steaks rare. She learned the rhythm of ranch life, when to have hot food ready for a man who'd been working in freezing wind, when to pack a dinner pail for days. He'd be gone until dark. One evening as she served supper, Morrison surprised her by speaking. "You're not what I expected," he said abruptly. Ruth paused in ladling stew. "Sir, most women who come out here are looking for a husband or an easy life. They don't last when they realize what the work really means. I told you, Mr. Morrison, I'm not afraid of hard work." He studied her with those unsettling pale eyes. "No, you're not. Where'd you say you were from?" "Philadelphia. Long way from home." "I have no home anymore," Ruth said simply. "This is as good a place as any." Something shifted in his expression. A crack in the stone facade. "The garden looks good," he said, which was practically a speech for him. Ruth allowed herself a small smile. "Thank you. I've saved most of the root vegetables. With proper storage, they'll last through winter." That night she heard it again. Morrison's voice from downstairs, low and anguished. This time she could make out words. "I'm sorry, Sarah. God, I'm so sorry." Sarah, his wife's name, perhaps. Ruth pulled her pillow over her head, trying to give him privacy, even in his solitude, but sleep was hard to come by with the sound of a grown man's grief seeping through the floorboards. The next morning, Morrison looked haggard, dark circles under his eyes. Ruth said nothing, just poured his coffee stronger than usual and added an extra egg to his plate. He ate mechanically, but before leaving he paused at the door. "The town gossip," he said without looking at her. "They tell you about my wife." "They mention she died," Ruth said carefully. "Nothing more. They say I killed her." His voice was flat, emotionless. "Some believe it." Ruth's hands stilled on the dish she was washing. "Did you?" He turned then, his eyes blazing with something that might have been rage or pain. "No, but I might as well have." And he was gone before she could respond. That day passed in uncomfortable silence. Ruth went about her duties, but her mind kept returning to Morrison's words. What had he meant? How did a man blame himself for his wife's death if he hadn't caused it? She was pulling bread from the oven when she heard horses approaching. Multiple horses riding fast. Morrison was still out on the range. Ruth wiped her hands on her apron and went to the window. 3 riders were approaching the house, and something about their purposeful pace made her nervous. They dismounted at the porch and one hammered on the door. "Morrison, we know you're in there." Ruth opened the door cautiously. "Mr. Morrison isn't here. Can I help you?" The lead man, burly with a badge pinned to his vest, looked her up and down with interest. Well, Caleb got himself a new woman. You'd best be careful. Miss, ask him what happened to the last one." "I'm the cook," Ruth said firmly. "Nothing more." "What's your business here?" "Sheriff's business," the man said, though something about him seemed off. His badge looked tarnished, and his companions had the rough look of hired guns rather than deputies. "We're investigating some missing cattle. Morrison's been known to help himself to his neighbor's stock when times are lean." "Mr. Morrison is an honest man," Ruth said, surprising herself with a conviction in her voice. The man laughed unpleasantly. "Honest lady? You don't know Caleb Morrison at all. Man's got blood on his hands, and that's enough, Daniels." Morrison's voice cut through the air like a whip. He sat his horse at the gate. Rifle laid casually across his saddle, but Ruth could see the tension in every line of his body. "Caleb," Daniel said with false friendliness. "Just telling your cook here she ought to know who she's working for. Get off my land." Morrison's voice was deadly quiet. "You've got no authority here, and we both know that badge is as fake as your concern about missing cattle." Danielle's face flushed dark red. "You think you're untouchable out here, Morrison? Think again. The Cattlemen's Association has long memories, and they haven't forgotten what you cost them." "I cost them nothing but their illegal grazing on government land. Now get out before I forget my manners." The 3 men mounted up, but Daniels turned back. "This isn't over." "And Miss," he looked at Ruth, "you'd best ask him about Sarah. Ask him why she was riding alone that day." They rode off in a cloud of dust, leaving Ruth and Morrison facing each other across the yard. She could see the muscle working in his jaw, the white-knuckled grip on his rifle. "Inside," he said tersely. Ruth retreated to the kitchen, her hands shaking as she poured coffee. Morrison followed, setting his rifle by the door with controlled movements. "You stood up for me," he said. "What? You've been fair to me," Ruth replied. "That man, he wasn't really a sheriff. Was he?" "No. Hired gun for the Cattlemen's Association. They've been trying to push me out for 3 years." He took the coffee she offered, his fingers brushing hers briefly. "I should tell you to pack your things. It's not safe here. Are you telling me to leave?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee. "No," he said finally. "But you should know what you're staying for. Sarah, my wife, she's dead because of me, because I stood up to the association. Testified against them in court. They couldn't get to me directly." So his voice broke slightly. "She was riding to town alone. I should have been with her, but I was too damn stubborn. Too sure I could protect her by keeping the ranch going." Ruth moved without thinking, placing her hand over his on the table. He jerked as if burned, but didn't pull away. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "But that wasn't your fault." He laughed bitterly. "Wasn't it? I knew they were dangerous. I knew they'd do anything to protect their interests. But I thought I was invincible. Thought right was on my side." He looked at her then. Really looked at her. And Ruth felt something shift between them. "You remind me of her sometimes, not in looks but the way you hum when you work. The way you've brought life back to that kitchen." Ruth withdrew her hand slowly. "I should check the bread." Ruth. Her name on his lips stopped her. It was the first time he'd used it. "Thank you for what you said to Daniels." She nodded and turned away, her heart beating strangely fast. As she pulled the last loaves from the oven, she could feel his eyes on her, and she knew something fundamental had changed. The careful distance between them had cracked just a little, but enough to let something else in. That night she didn't hear him talking to shadows. Instead, she heard the soft sound of his footsteps pacing, as if he too were grappling with the shift in their careful arrangement. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the windows, a wolf howled long and mournful, echoing the loneliness that lived in the bones of this vast, unforgiving land. The blizzard struck without warning. 3 days later, Ruth had noticed the strange yellow tinge to the afternoon sky. The way the cattle huddled together in the near pasture, but she'd had no experience with Wyoming winters to know what these signs meant. Morrison had ridden out early that morning to check on the herd in the North Valley, taking only hardtack and jerky, despite Ruth's protest that he should wait for a proper breakfast. By mid-afternoon, the wind had picked up to a howl, and the first fat snowflakes began to fall. Within an hour, the world outside the windows had become a solid wall of white. Ruth kept the fires burning high and set pots of water to boil on the stove, instinct telling her to prepare for the worst. Night fell early, swallowed by the storm. Morrison hadn't returned. Ruth paced the kitchen, peering out the windows, though she could see nothing but swirling snow. The thought of him out there, possibly lost or injured, made her stomach clench with fear. She'd seen what winter could do back east, but this was something else entirely. A primitive force that seemed intent on erasing the world. She was just pulling on her coat, determined to at least check the barn. When the back door burst open, Morrison stumbled in on a gust of snow and wind, ice coating his beard and eyebrows, his face raw and red with cold. Kill. The name escaped before she could stop it. He was shaking violently, his fingers too numb to work the buttons of his coat. Ruth rushed to help him, her hands fumbling with the frozen fabric. "The fire," she said urgently. "We need to get you to the fire," but when she tried to guide him to the main room, he collapsed to his knees, a harsh sound escaping his throat. "Can't feel my feet." Ruth's nurse's training from helping her mother took over. "Frostbite," she said grimly. "We need to warm you slowly. Can you make it to the kitchen chair?" Together they managed to get him seated near the stove. Ruth knelt and pulled off his boots, biting back a gasp at the white, waxy appearance of his toes. His hands were in similar condition. "This is going to hurt," she warned, filling a basin with cool water, not warm, which could cause more damage. "But we have to restore circulation gradually." Morrison gritted his teeth as she immersed his feet, the pain of returning sensation making him grip the chair arms until his knuckles went white. Ruth worked with quiet efficiency, gradually increasing the water temperature, massaging his hands to restore blood flow. "How long were you out there?" she asked, trying to distract him from the pain. "Lost my bearings when the storm hit," he said through clenched teeth. "Horse threw me and bolted. Had to walk. Don't know how long. Followed the fence line." Ruth's heart clenched at the thought of how close he'd come to dying. Men had been found frozen just yards from their own doors in storms like this. "You're lucky," she said softly. "Am I?" He looked down at her, kneeling at his feet, her dark hair escaping its pins as she worked. "Ruth, I hush," she said. "Save your strength. We're not done yet." She wrapped his feet in soft cloths and turned her attention to his hands, repeating the process. The kitchen was warm and close, filled with the sound of the storm outside and their breathing inside. As feeling returned to his extremities, Morrison's shaking increased. "You need to get out of these wet clothes," Ruth said, her practical nature overcoming any impropriety. "Can you make it upstairs?" He nodded. Though when he stood, he swayed dangerously. Without thinking, Ruth ducked under his arm, taking his weight. He was solid and heavy, and she could smell horses and snow and something essentially male that made her pulse quicken. They made it to his room, a place Ruth had never entered. It was as spare as the rest of the house. But she noticed a small tin type on the dresser of a pretty blonde woman. "Sarah," she assumed. "I can manage from here," Morrison said, though his hands were still clumsy. "I'll bring hot soup," Ruth said, averting her eyes. "And more blankets." She fled downstairs, her cheeks burning for reasons that had nothing to do with the fire. She heated the stew from dinner and gathered extra quilts from the linen closet. When she knocked on his door, his voice bidding her enter was rough. He was in bed, covered to the chin, but his face was still too pale. Ruth set the soup on the bedside table and spread the extra quilts over him. As she leaned across to tuck them in, his hand caught hers. "You saved my life," he said simply. "You saved your own life by making it home," she replied, but she didn't pull her hand away. They stayed like that for a moment, his cold fingers wrapped around her warm ones, the storm raging outside like a living thing trying to get in. Then slowly, he raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her palm. The gesture was so gentle, so at odds with his usual gruffness, that Ruth felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. Ruth fled again, her hand burning where his lips had touched. She spent the rest of the night in the kitchen, keeping the fires burning and listening to the storm. Twice she climbed the stairs to check on him, finding him sleeping restlessly, muttering words she couldn't make out. The blizzard raged for 2 days. During that time, the careful boundaries between employer and employee dissolved like snow in spring. Morrison, weakened by his ordeal, allowed Ruth to tend him without protest. She brought him meals, changed his bandages, and read to him from the few books in the house when he couldn't sleep. On the second night, as the storm finally began to weaken, he told her about Sarah. "She was the daughter of a judge in Denver," he said, staring at the ceiling. "What she saw in a rough cowhand like me I'll never know. But she said I made her laugh." His voice grew soft with memory. "She wasn't built for this life, really. Too gentle, too refined. But she tried so hard to be a rancher's wife." Ruth sat in the chair beside his bed, her hands folded in her lap. "She loved you." "Yes," he said simply. And I loved her, but love wasn't enough to keep her safe. He turned to look at Ruth. Then I swore I'd never let another woman into my life. The cost is too high. We don't always get to choose, Ruth said quietly. Life has a way of making its own plans. He studied her face in the lamplight. You're stronger than she was. Tougher. You belong out here in a way she never did. I'm just trying to survive. Ruth said, No, Morrison said with surprising firmness. You're living. There's a difference. The way you've taken to this place. The way you stood up to Daniels. The way he paused, seeming to struggle with the words. The way you've made this house feel less like a tomb. Ruth felt heat rise in her cheeks. You hired me to cook, Mr. Morrison. Nothing more, Caleb. He corrected. And we both know that's not true anymore. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Ruth stood abruptly. You should rest. The fever is making you say things you don't mean. His hand shot out, catching her wrist. I haven't had a fever since yesterday and you know it. Ruth looked down at his hand on her wrist, then up at his face. What she saw there made her breath catch. Caleb, please, I can't. I won't be any man's convenience. His grip gentled but didn't release. Is that what you think? That I see you as convenient? He laughed. But there was no humor in it. Ruth, you terrify me. Every smile, every hum tune, every moment you're near. It all terrifies me because I can feel these walls I've built starting to crumble. Then maybe they need to crumble, Ruth whispered. He pulled her down until she was sitting on the edge of the bed, his hand still holding hers. I'm no good for you, he said. I'm marked by death, haunted by ghosts. The association wants me gone and they won't stop until I am. You should run far and fast from me. I've done enough running. Ruth said, My whole life I've been running from something, from poverty, from loneliness, from the memory of everyone I've lost. Maybe it's time I stopped. Caleb reached up with his free hand, touching her cheek with infinite gentleness. You know what I wanted when I saw you standing in my yard that first night? I wanted to send you away immediately because I knew that you were dangerous, that you'd make me feel things I'd sworn never to feel again. And now, Ruth's voice was barely a whisper. Now I want much more than I have any right to want, he said, unconsciously echoing words he'd speak later. I want to hear you humming in my kitchen every morning. I want to see you reading by the fire in the evenings. He stopped, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. God help me. I want you. Ruth leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. The storm's passing, she said irrelevantly. Yes, he agreed, understanding that she meant more than the weather. She stood then gently extracting herself from his hold. Sleep, she said. We'll see what the morning brings. But as she reached the door, he spoke again. Ruth, that first night when I hired you, I said I wanted just a cook, nothing more. She paused, not turning around. I remember. I lied. Ruth fled to her room, her heart pounding. She pressed her palms to her burning cheeks, trying to make sense of the tumult of emotions inside her. Outside, the wind was dying down and through her window. She could see the first stars appearing through the breaking clouds. Everything had changed in the space of a storm. The careful distance, the professional boundaries, the safety of defined roles, all swept away like snow before the wind. In its place was something new and fragile and terrifying in its possibility. She thought of Caleb lying in his bed, fighting his own demons and desires. She thought of Sarah's picture on his dresser, of the guilt he carried like a physical weight. She thought of Daniels and his threats, of the danger that circled this ranch like the wolves in the night. And despite it all, or perhaps because of it, Ruth knew with sudden absolute clarity that she was exactly where she belonged. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The aftermath of the storm, the undeniable shift in their relationship, the external threats that hadn't disappeared just because two lonely people had found each other in the darkness. But tonight, with the storm finally breaking and a new understanding blooming between them, Ruth allowed herself to hope. She'd thought she'd come to Wyoming simply to survive. But perhaps, just perhaps, she'd come here to live. The morning after the storm dawned crystal clear and blindingly white. Ruth rose early as was her habit. But everything felt different now. As she dressed, her fingers trembled slightly, and she had to take several deep breaths before descending the stairs. Caleb was already in the kitchen, standing by the window with a cup of coffee. He turned at her entrance, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, the memory of last night's confessions hanging between them like morning mist. Your feet? Ruth asked, taking refuge in practical concerns. Better, he said. Thanks to you. He paused, seeming to struggle with something. Ruth, about last night. The cattle, she interrupted, not ready for that conversation. Won't they need tending after the storm? He accepted her deflection with a slight nod. Yes, I'll need to dig out to the barn first, then check on the herd. He set down his cup. It'll be a long day. Ruth busied herself at the stove, acutely aware of his presence behind her when she turned with his breakfast plate. He was still watching her, an unreadable expression on his face. We can't pretend it didn't happen, he said quietly. No, Ruth agreed, setting the plate before him. But we can take time to think about what it means. He caught her hand as she turned away. I meant what I said, every word. Ruth squeezed his fingers briefly, then pulled away. I know, that's what frightens me. The day passed in a flurry of activity. Caleb worked to clear paths to the barn and outbuildings while Ruth tackled the household chores that had accumulated during the storm. But there was a new awareness between them, a charge in the air whenever they were in the same room. It was late afternoon when Ruth heard the sound of approaching horses. She looked out to see a small group of riders picking their way through the snow-covered road. Her heart sank as she recognized Daniels in the lead, but this time he was accompanied by men she didn't know. Caleb emerged from the barn, rifle in hand. As the riders entered the yard, Ruth watched from the kitchen window, her hands clenched in her apron. Morrison, Daniels called out, his breath pluming in the cold air. We need to talk. Talk from there, Caleb replied, not lowering his rifle. Daniels dismounted anyway, his hand resting on his pistol. The storm hit everyone hard. Lost cattle, damaged property. The association is calling in debts. I don't owe the association anything. That's not how they see it. Daniels pulled out a paper. This here's a notice. You've got 30 days to pay what you owe for grazing rights or we'll be back to collecting cattle. Those are public lands, Caleb said evenly. I don't pay for what's free to all. Nothing's free anymore, Morrison. Times are changing. You can either change with them, or Daniels glanced toward the house where Ruth's silhouette was visible in the window. Or things might get unpleasant for everyone. The threat was clear. Caleb's jaw tightened. Get off my land, Daniels remounted with a cold smile. 30 days, Morrison, think about what you've got to lose now. His eyes found Ruth in the window. Pretty thing like that shouldn't be mixed up in your troubles. After they left, Caleb stood in the yard for a long moment, staring after them. When he finally came inside, his face was dark with anger. Pack your things, he said without preamble. Ruth's heart dropped. What? You heard him. They'll use you to get to me. I won't have another woman's blood on my hands. I'm not Sarah, Ruth said firmly. And I'm not leaving. He slammed his hand on the table, making her jump. Damn it, woman. Don't you understand? They killed her because of me. Shot her down on the road like an animal, and I couldn't do anything to stop it. Then teach me, Ruth said. He stared at her. What? Teach me to defend myself, to shoot, to ride properly, to survive out here? She moved closer to him. I'm not some delicate flower. Caleb, I've survived fever that killed my whole family. I've traveled across half the country alone. I walked through a blizzard to get to your door. Stop trying to protect me by sending me away. You don't know what you're asking. I'm asking you to treat me as an equal, not as something fragile to be locked away. She reached up to touch his face. I'm asking you to let me choose my own risks. He caught her hand, pressing it against his cheek. I can't lose you too, he whispered. I can't go through that again. Then don't push me away, Ruth said. We're stronger together than apart. For a moment, she thought he would argue further. Then, with a sound that was part sigh and part surrender, he pulled her into his arms. Ruth went willingly, feeling the solid strength of him, the rapid beat of his heart against her ear. You're a stubborn woman, Ruth called well. He murmured into her hair. I learned from the best, she replied, which drew a rusty chuckle from him. When he pulled back to look at her, his eyes were serious. If you stay, things will get dangerous. The association doesn't make idle threats. I know, and people will talk. A single woman living with a single man. Let them talk. He cupped her face in his hands. I can't offer you much. A hard life, constant danger, a man with too many ghosts. I'm not asking for much, Ruth said. Just a chance. He kissed her then. And it was nothing like the gentle press of lips to her palm. This was desperate and hungry, full of loneliness and longing and the fear of loss. Ruth responded with equal fervor, pouring all her own grief and hope into the contact. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Well, Ruth said shakily, I suppose that settles that. Despite everything, Caleb smiled, a real smile that transformed his harsh features. I suppose it does. The next days brought a new routine. True to his word, Caleb began teaching Ruth to shoot. They started with his old Navy Colt. Ruth learning to handle the weight and recoil. Her first shots went wild, but she was determined, and by the end of the week she could hit a tin can at 20 paces. "You're a natural," Caleb said, watching her reload with growing confidence. "I have a good teacher," Ruth replied, blowing smoke from the barrel. "He also taught her to ride properly, not the sedate side saddle appropriate for ladies, but astride like a man, able to control her mount in any situation." Ruth took to it eagerly, relishing the freedom of galloping across the snow-covered prairie. In the evenings they no longer maintained separate spaces. Ruth would sit by the fire mending while Caleb worked on his ledgers, and sometimes he would read aloud from one of his few books. There was a comfortable domesticity to it that neither had expected to find again, but the shadow of the association's threat hung over them. Caleb rode out daily to check for signs of trouble, and he insisted Ruth keep the cult within reach at all times. The 30-day deadline loomed like a storm cloud on the horizon. One evening, as they sat together on the worn sofa, Ruth asked, "What will you do when the 30 days are up?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "Fight if I have to, but I've been thinking there might be another way." He looked at her. "There's a federal marshal in Cheyenne. A real one, not like Daniels. If I could get to him, present evidence of what the association's been doing." "It's dangerous," Ruth said. "They'll be watching the roads, which is why I'd have to go carefully, take the long way around, maybe through the mountains." Ruth considered this when soon before the deadline. He pulled her closer. "I'll need you to stay here. Keep the ranch running. Can you do that?" "You know I can," Ruth said, "but Caleb, be careful. I've lost too much already. I can't lose you too." He kissed her forehead. "You won't. I promise." But even as he said it, they both knew it was a promise he might not be able to keep. The West was full of broken promises and unmarked graves, and the association had proven they weren't above murder to get what they wanted. That night, as they reluctantly parted at her bedroom door, propriety still maintaining some hold despite their acknowledged feelings, Caleb caught her hand. "Ruth," he said softly. "If something happens, nothing will happen," she interrupted. "But if it does," he persisted, "there's money hidden in a coffee tin behind the loose board in the pantry. Enough to get you somewhere safe." "Caleb, promise me," he said urgently. "Promise you'll run if things go bad." Ruth looked into his eyes, seeing the fear there, not for himself but for her. "I promise." She lied. He seemed to sense the lie but didn't call her on it. Instead, he raised her hand to his lips as he had that night during the storm. "Sleep well, Ruth." But sleep was elusive that night. Ruth lay in her narrow bed, listening to the familiar sounds of the house and the prairie beyond. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack, and the sound seemed like an omen. Change was coming. She could feel it in the air, in the tension that grew daily between the small ranchers and the powerful association. The storm that had brought her and Caleb together was nothing compared to the storm that was brewing on the horizon. But as Ruth finally drifted off to sleep, she found herself oddly at peace. She'd spent so long running from life, from pain, from the possibility of loss. Now facing danger hidden with a man she was coming to love, she felt more alive than she had since before the fever took her family. Whatever came next, she would meet it with eyes open and gun loaded. The West had made her harder, stronger, and if the association thought they could frighten her away, they were about to learn otherwise. In his own room, Caleb lay awake making plans. The federal marshal was his best hope, but getting to Cheyenne alive would be a challenge. He thought of Ruth, of her fierce determination and surprising strength. Part of him still wanted to send her away to safety, but he was beginning to understand that safety was an illusion, and that Ruth had the right to choose her own path. He'd lost Sarah by trying to protect her, by keeping her sheltered while he fought his battles alone. He wouldn't make the same mistake with Ruth. This time they would stand together, come what may. The moon rose full and bright over the snow-covered land, casting everything in shades of silver and shadow. And in the Morrison Ranch house, two people who had found each other against all odds, prepared to face whatever the dawn would bring. The attack came on a moonless night when the wind howled like a chorus of the damned. Ruth woke to the sound of breaking glass downstairs, followed by the acrid smell of smoke. She grabbed the Colt from her bedside table and rushed to the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. Dark figures moved in the yard below, at least 6 of them, their faces covered with bandanas. Orange flames were already licking at the barn's walls, and she could hear the terrified screaming of horses trapped inside. "Caleb!" She burst from her room to find him already in the hallway, pulling on his boots, rifle in hand. "Stay inside," he commanded. But Ruth was already heading for the stairs. "The horses, I'll get them. You watch the house." He caught her arm as she tried to pass. "Ruth, please. I need to know you're safe." A window shattered somewhere below, followed by cruel laughter. Ruth nodded tightly. Go. I'll hold them off. They split at the bottom of the stairs. Caleb heading for the back door while Ruth took position at the front window. She could see riders circling the house, whooping and firing into the air. The barn was fully ablaze now, casting hellish shadows across the snow. Ruth aimed carefully through the broken window and squeezed the trigger. A rider cursed and clutched his shoulder, nearly falling from his horse. She ducked as return fire splintered the window frame above her head. Morrison, a voice called from outside. Not Daniels, but someone younger, meaner. Come on out. Time to pay what you owe. Ruth fired again, forcing the riders to scatter. Through the chaos, she could see Caleb at the barn, throwing open stall doors, driving the panicked horses out into the night. Silhouetted against the flames, he made an easy target. No, she breathed, seeing one of the attackers raise a rifle in Caleb's direction. Without thinking, Ruth burst through the front door, firing as she ran. Caleb, get down. He dove aside as bullets whined through the space where he'd been standing. Ruth felt something tug at her sleeve, spinning her around. She hit the frozen ground hard, the Colt flying from her hand. Caleb's voice raw with fear. She rolled, scrambling for the gun as boots crunched in the snow nearby. A hand grabbed her hair, yanking her head back. Well, Morrison's woman wants to play too. The man's breath reeked of whiskey and tobacco. Boss might pay extra for his words cut off in a gurgle as Caleb's rifle but connected with his skull. The man dropped and Caleb hauled Ruth to her feet. You're hurt. He touched her arm where blood was seeping through her night dress. Just grazed. She gasped. Caleb, the house. They turned to see flames beginning to lick at the kitchen wall where someone had thrown a torch. More riders were converging on their position. The root cellar. Caleb said, go. They ran. Caleb firing behind them to cover their retreat. The root cellar door was hidden beneath a snowdrift behind the house. Caleb wrenched it open and pushed Ruth inside, following quickly and pulling the door shut just as bullets thudded it into the wood above them. The cellar was pitch black and cramped, barely large enough for two people among the stored vegetables and preserves. They pressed against the earthen wall, breathing hard, listening to the chaos above. Let me see your arm, Caleb whispered. It's nothing, Ruth insisted, though she could feel blood running down to her wrist. Caleb, everything we've built can be rebuilt, he said firmly. You can't be replaced. His hands were gentle as he tore a strip from his shirt to bind her wound. In the darkness, every touch was magnified. Electric. They'll burn it all, Ruth said, her voice breaking slightly. Let them. His arms came around her, pulling her against his chest. We're alive. That's what matters. Above them, they could hear boots stomping through the house, crashes as furniture was overturned, the crackling glow of flames. Ruth buried her face in Caleb's shirt, breathing in the scent of smoke and gunpowder and him. I should have left, she whispered. You were right. I've brought you nothing, but he silenced her with a kiss, fierce and desperate. You've brought me back to life, he said against her lips. I was dead for 3 years just going through the motions. Then you came along with your stubborn pride and your humming and your terrible lies about leaving if things got dangerous. Despite everything, Ruth almost smiled. You knew? I hoped. He pressed his forehead to hers. God help me. I hoped. They stayed hidden as the night wore on, listening as the attackers gradually tired of their destruction. Finally, as dawn approached, the sounds faded away. Caleb asked the cellar door open, peering out cautiously. The devastation was complete. The barn was a smoking ruin, the house badly damaged, black smoke still rising from the kitchen end, but they were alive. They emerged into the gray dawn light, surveying the destruction. Ruth's carefully tended garden was trampled, the chicken coop smashed, tools and equipment scattered and broken. But as they stood there, still alive against all odds, Ruth felt something fierce and unbreakable rise in her chest. They wanted to break us, she said. They failed. Caleb replied. Movement caught their eye. Caleb's horse, Buck, emerging from the tree in where he'd fled during the fire. Other horses followed, drawn back by familiar territory. Not all of them, but enough. We can rebuild, Ruth said. It wasn't a question. Caleb looked at her, blood on her night dress, soot in her hair, eyes blazing with determination, and felt his heart constrict. Ruth Caldwell, he said. Will you marry me? She blinked, momentarily speechless. What? I know this isn't the romantic proposal you deserve. He gestured at the smoking ruins around them. But I almost lost you tonight. And I realized I don't want to face another day without you being mine in every way that matters. Not as my cook or my whatever we are now. As my wife. Ruth looked at him. This hard man who'd shown her his soft heart. Who'd taught her to shoot and ride and survive. who'd kissed her in a root cellar while their world burned above them. Yes, she said simply. He caught her up in his arms, lifting her off her feet, and for a moment they could forget the destruction around them. When he set her down, his eyes were bright with something that might have been tears. "We'll ride to town," he said. "Find the preacher, make it official, then we come back and we rebuild." Ruth finished and we show them that Morrison Ranch doesn't break that easily. They salvaged what they could from the house. Clothes, ammunition, the coffee tin with Caleb's hidden money, miraculously untouched. Ruth insisted on saving her mother's Bible from her room, though its edges were singed. Caleb retrieved his guns and what food had survived in the root cellar. As they prepared to leave, Ruth noticed something glinting in the ashes of the barn. She picked it up. A brass button with an insignia. She recognized Caleb. She showed him the button. "This is from an association uniform, the kind their hired guns wear." His face darkened. "Evidence. The federal marshal will want to see that." They mounted up on the horses they'd recovered. Ruth riding astride in a pair of Caleb's trousers. Her ruined nightdress exchanged for one of his shirts. As they rode away from the smoking ruins, Ruth looked back once. "We'll come back," Caleb promised, reading her thoughts. "I know," she faced forward toward town, toward their future. "And when we do, we'll be ready for them." The ride to Cedar Ridge took most of the morning. They were a sight, smoke-stained and weary. Ruth in men's clothes with a bloodied bandage on her arm. Caleb grim-faced and dangerous-looking. People stared as they rode down Main Street, whispers following in their wake. They found Reverend Harper at the small church preparing his Sunday sermon. The elderly man's eyes widened at their appearance. "Reverend," Caleb said without preamble, "we need you to marry us now. Mr. Morrison is everything. Are you both all right?" "There was trouble at the ranch," Ruth said, "but yes, we're all right and we want to be married before anything else happens." The Reverend looked between them, taking in their clasped hands. The determination in their faces. "I'll need witnesses. I'll witness." Mrs. Chin, who ran the boarding house, stepped forward. "She'd been arranging flowers in the church and my husband is just outside." Within minutes, they were standing before the altar. It wasn't the wedding Ruth had dreamed of as a girl. No white dress, no flowers, no family to celebrate with them. But as she looked into Caleb's eyes and spoke her vows, she knew it was perfect in its own way. "I, Ruth Caldwell, take you, Caleb Morrison, to be my husband, to stand beside you in good times and bad, in safety and danger, in rebuilding and in fighting, till death do us part." Caleb's voice was rough with emotion as he spoke his own vows. "I, Caleb Morrison, take you, Ruth, to be my wife, to protect you as you protect me, to love you as fiercely as you love, to face whatever comes as long as we face it together, till death do us part." When Reverend Harper pronounced them husband and wife, Caleb kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to Mrs. Chen's eyes. "Now what?" Ruth asked as they left the church. "Now," Caleb said, his jaw set with determination. "We send a telegram to the federal marshal, and then we prepare for war." As they walked hand in hand down the dusty street, Ruth felt the weight of the cult at her hip and the strength of her husband beside her. They'd lost their home but found something more valuable, a partnership forged in fire and sealed in love. The association had wanted to break them. Instead, they'd created something unbreakable. And Ruth smiled, thinking of the surprise those hired guns would get when they realized the Morrison Ranch now had 2 fighters instead of 1. The war wasn't over, but for the first time since that terrible night when she'd lost her family to fever. Ruth Caldwell, now Ruth Morrison, was ready to fight for the life she'd found. And heaven helped anyone who tried to take it from her. The news of the attack on the Morrison Ranch spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire on dry grass. By the time Caleb and Ruth returned from sending their telegram to the federal marshal, a small crowd had gathered outside the sheriff's office. Real Sheriff Tom Bradley, who'd been away visiting his sick mother, had returned to find his town in turmoil and his badge being worn by an imposter. "Morrison," Bradley called out, pushing through the crowd. He was a weathered man in his 50s. "Honest but cautious. Heard you had trouble out your way." "The association burned us out," Caleb said flatly. "Tried to kill us both." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some faces showed sympathy, others skepticism, and a few outright hostility. Ruth recognized several townspeople who'd turned her away when she'd first sought work. "That's a serious accusation," Bradley said carefully. "You have proof?" Ruth stepped forward, producing the brass button. "This came off one of their uniforms. And there are 6 witnesses who saw the riders." "What witnesses?" Someone called out. "You 2 were alone out there." "The horses saw," Ruth said, her voice carrying clearly. "The cattle saw. The land itself bears witness. Go look at the ashes if you doubt us." Mrs. Chin pushed through the crowd. I believe them. That Daniels fellow who claimed to be a sheriff. He was in my boarding house last night drinking with 5 other men. They didn't come back until dawn, all smelling of smoke. That's hearsay, growled Jake Putnam, who ran the livery stable and was known to be friendly with the association. Could have been any fire. Could have been. Caleb agreed dangerously. But it wasn't. Sheriff Bradley raised his hands for quiet. All right, everyone calm down. Morrison, you say you contacted the federal marshal? Telegram went out an hour ago, Caleb confirmed. He should be here within the week. The crowd stirred uneasily. Federal involvement meant serious business, and many of the townspeople had their own complicated relationships with the law. Until then, Bradley said, I'm ordering all association activities in this county suspended. Any man claiming to represent them will answer to me. You can't do that, Putnam protested. The association has legal rights. The association has been operating outside the law. Bradley cut him off. And if they're behind this attack, they'll face justice. He looked at Caleb and Ruth. You two have somewhere safe to stay. We're going back to the ranch, Ruth said, ignoring the gasps from the crowd. Ma'am, with all due respect, that's foolish. Bradley said, they burned you out once and we survived, Ruth interrupted. We're not abandoning our land. That's what they want. Caleb put his arm around his wife's shoulders. We'll be ready for them this time. The crowd began to disperse, but Ruth noticed the mix of expressions. Admiration from some, concern from others, and calculation from a few she marked as potential threats. As they prepared to leave town with supplies salvaged on credit from sympathetic merchants, an unexpected voice called out, Mr. Morrison, Mrs. Morrison. They turned to see a young woman hurrying toward them. Emma Hartley, the school teacher's daughter. Ruth remembered her from their few trips to town, a quiet girl of perhaps 19. Miss Hartley, Caleb said wearily. Emma glanced around nervously, then stepped closer. I wanted to warn you, my father, he's friendly with some of the association men. I heard them talking last night before she gestured helplessly. They said if burning you out didn't work, they had other plans. What kind of plans? Ruth asked gently. I don't know exactly, but they mentioned something about the water rights, about damming up Willow Creek upstream from your property. Emma's eyes were wide with fear, but also determination. I know people think my father's a good man, but he's not. He takes their money and looks the other way. Caleb studied the girl carefully. Why are you telling us this? Emma's chin lifted. Because what they're doing is wrong. And because she looked at Ruth, because you're the only woman in this town who stood up to them. When you held that gun on Daniels, when you defended your husband, it made me think maybe I could be brave too. Ruth reached out and squeezed the girl's hand. Thank you. Your courage won't be forgotten. As Emma hurried away, Caleb and Ruth exchanged glances. The water rights issue was serious. Without access to Willow Creek, their ranch would be worthless. Burned buildings or not. We need to check the creek boundaries, Caleb said. Make sure our claims are properly filed. They spent the rest of the day at the land office, poring over maps and documents with the clerk. A nervous man named Withers, who kept glancing at the door as if expecting association men to burst in at any moment. Your water rights are solid, Withers confirmed, pointing to the relevant passages. Filed properly in 81, renewed last year. They can't legally dam the creek without your permission. Since when has the association worried about what's legal? Ruth asked. Withers had no answer to that. As the sun began to sink toward the mountains, they started the long ride back to what remained of their ranch. The horses were loaded with supplies, lumber, nails, canvas for temporary shelter, ammunition, and food. Several townspeople had contributed, moved by their determination, or perhaps by guilt over past indifference. The ruins of their home looked even more desolate in the dying light. The barn was nothing but blackened timbers and ash. The house a half-collapsed shell. But as they dismounted, Ruth felt that same fierce determination rise in her chest. We'll start with a temporary shelter, she said practically. Canvas and salvage lumber. Then we rebuild properly come spring. They worked until full dark, erecting a crude but functional shelter in the lee of the remaining walls. Caleb had salvaged the stove, miraculously intact, and they managed to create a space that was part tent, part lean-to, but weatherproof and defensible. As they sat by their small fire that night, sharing a simple meal of beans and biscuit, the reality of their situation settled over them. They were alone on the prairie, their home destroyed, powerful enemies arrayed against them. But they were also married, united, and unwilling to surrender. Tell me about the water rights, Ruth said. If they dam the creek, the ranch dies, Caleb said simply. No water means no cattle, no garden, no life. It's a smarter move than burning us out. Perfectly legal. If they can claim some upstream right we don't know about, then we need to patrol the creek boundaries. We need to do more than that. Caleb stared into the fire. We need allies. The association's been pushing out small ranchers for years, using whatever tactics work. There must be others who'd stand with us if they thought we had a chance. Ruth considered this. The Hendersons, 2 valleys over, Mrs. Chin mentioned they'd been having trouble with association men cutting their fences. And the Kowalski brothers north of town, Caleb added, Polish immigrants good with horses. The association's been trying to buy them out cheap. So we're not alone. Ruth said, we just need to help them realize they're not either. That night, lying in their makeshift shelter with the stars visible through gaps in the canvas, they made plans not just for rebuilding but for resistance. The association had wealth and political power. But they'd made a crucial mistake. They'd created too many enemies, pushed too hard, taken too much. I never thought I'd be starting a range war. Ruth murmured against Caleb's chest. You're not starting anything, he said firmly. They started it when they killed Sarah. When they burned us out, when they decided might makes right, we're just finishing it. The next days blurred together in a haze of hard work and constant vigilance. They took turns keeping watch. Rifle always within reach. Caleb rode out to speak with neighboring ranchers while Ruth worked on making their shelter more livable and defending what remained of their property. On the 3rd day she had visitors. The Henderson family. Robert, his wife Mary, and their 2 grown sons arrived in a wagon loaded with supplies. Mrs. Morrison, Mary Henderson said, climbing down from the wagon seat. We heard what happened. Came to help. Ruth felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected kindness. We're grateful, but it's dangerous to be associated with us right now. Robert Henderson, a stocky man with kind eyes, shook his head. Ma'am, we're already in danger. Have been since we refused to sell to the association last spring. Figured it's time we stopped facing it alone. The men set to work immediately, beginning to frame a new barn, while the women organized supplies and cooked. By evening, the Kowalski brothers had arrived with more lumber and their own stories of association harassment. They poisoned water hole last month, Stephen Kowalski said in his heavily accented English. Killed 20 head of cattle, Sheriff Bradley. You do nothing then. Bradley's trying now, Caleb said. But he's one man and the association has deep pockets. Then we be many men, Stephen's brother, Alexei, said firmly. Together we fight. As the group shared supper around the fire, Ruth felt something she hadn't experienced since before her family died. The warmth of community, of belonging. These people had come despite the danger, choosing solidarity over safety. That night, as she and Caleb lay together listening to the wind, she said, They're brave to stand with us. They're smart, Caleb corrected. They know if we fall, they're next. The association's greed knows no bounds. Still, Ruth said, it takes courage to act on that knowledge. He pulled her closer. You would know about courage. The peaceful interlude ended the next morning when riders appeared on the horizon. Caleb and the other men grabbed their rifles, but as the group drew closer, they saw it wasn't association men. It was Sheriff Bradley with 2 deputies and a stranger in a black suit. Federal Marshal James McBride, Bradley announced as they dismounted. He made better time than expected. Marshal McBride was a tall, lean man with sharp eyes that missed nothing. He surveyed the burned ruins, the makeshift shelter, the armed ranchers, and finally settled his gaze on Caleb and Ruth. Mr. Morrison, Mrs. Morrison, I received your telegram. I'd like to hear your full account. They spent the morning detailing everything, the threats, Danielle's impersonation of a sheriff, the attack, the evidence they'd preserved. The other ranchers added their own stories of association harassment. McBride listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in a small book. Finally he stood. I've heard enough. Sheriff Bradley, I'm deputizing you and your men under federal authority. We're going to pay the Cattlemen's Association a visit. Sir, Bradley said nervously. They have a lot of men, a lot of guns. And I have the full weight of federal law, McBride said coldly. They can submit to arrest or they can fight the United States government. Their choice. As the lawmen prepared to leave, McBride turned to Caleb and Ruth. You two started something here. These people look to you for leadership. Are you prepared for that responsibility? Ruth and Caleb exchanged glances. They'd wanted only to survive, to rebuild their life together. But sometimes, Ruth reflected, life demanded more than mere survival. We're prepared, she said firmly. McBride nodded. Then hold this ground. If the association wants a fight, we'll give them one they won't forget. As the lawmen rode away, Ruth looked around at their allies, the Hendersons, the Kowalskis, others who'd arrived throughout the morning, all of them watching her and Caleb with hope and determination. "Well," she said to her husband, "I suppose we're leading a revolution." Caleb smiled grimly. Sarah would have been terrified. "I'm terrified," Ruth admitted. "But I'm not Sarah." "No," he agreed, kissing her forehead. "You're not? You're something the association never counted on. A woman who shoots back." The sun climbed higher over the Wyoming plains, illuminating the ashes of the old and the framework of the new. And Ruth Morrison, formerly Ruth Caldwell, orphan and wanderer, stood ready to fight for the home she'd found and the future she'd claimed. The days following Marshall McBride's arrival brought a tentative peace to the valley. News traveled fast that federal law had come to Wyoming, and the association's hired guns seemed to melt away like snow in spring sunshine. But Caleb and Ruth knew better than to trust this quiet. "They're planning something," Caleb said one evening as they worked side by side on the new barn frame. The structure was taking shape with help from their neighbors, rising from the ashes like a phoenix of rough-hewn timber. Ruth paused in her hammering to wipe sweat from her brow. "McBride arrested 3 of them, including Daniels. That has to count for something. Men like that have lawyers, bail money. They'll be out within days." He looked toward the horizon where storm clouds were gathering, and the association still has plenty of men on their payroll, as if to prove his point. A rider appeared on the ridge above the ranch. Ruth instinctively reached for the rifle leaning against the barn wall, but Caleb stayed her hand. The rider was alone, approaching slowly with his hands visible. As he drew closer, Ruth recognized him. Thomas Hartley, the school teacher whose daughter had warned them about the water rights threat. He looked older than his 50 years, his face drawn with worry. "Morrison," he called out, stopping a safe distance away. "I need to talk to you, both of you." "Talk from there," Caleb replied, his hand resting on his pistol. Hartley dismounted slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "I know you have no reason to trust me. Emma told me she spoke to you. I've done things I'm not proud of. Taken association money, looked the other way when I shouldn't have. Why are you here?" Ruth asked directly. "Because they're planning something worse than burning barns," Hartley said. "My conscience. I can't be part of it anymore. Not after seeing what they did to you. What they're planning to do to others." Caleb studied the man carefully. "What are they planning? The damn idea was just the start. They're bringing in a judge from Cheyenne, one they own completely. He's going to rule that all the water rights in the valley were improperly filed, that the land reverts to open range." Hartley's voice dropped. "They plan to drive everyone out legally this time. And if that doesn't work, Ruth prompted. They're bringing in professional guns from Kansas. Not local toughs like Daniels, but real killers. Men who've done this before in other territories." Caleb and Ruth exchanged glances. This was worse than they'd thought. "When?" Caleb asked. 2 weeks, maybe less. The judge arrives Monday." Hartley pulled a rolled paper from his coat. "This is a copy of the brief they'll present. I stole it from the association office." Ruth took the paper, scanning it quickly. The legal language was complex, but the intent was clear. Invalidate every small rancher's claim in the valley, opening the land for association control. "You're taking a big risk bringing us this," Ruth said, looking up at Hartley. The man's shoulders slumped. "My daughter looks at me like I'm a hero because I'm her father. But when she learned what I'd been part of, the disappointment in her eyes," he straightened. "I want to be the man she thought I was. Might be too late, but I have to try." "It's never too late," Ruth said gently, remembering her own journey from despair to hope. After Hartley left, Caleb and Ruth called together their allies, the Hendersons, Kowalskis, and several other families gathered in the makeshift common area they'd created near the new barn. Ruth spread out the stolen documents, explaining what Hartley had revealed. "We need McBride," Robert Henderson said immediately. "Federal law trumps local judges." "McBride's in Cheyenne testifying in the case against Daniels," Caleb replied. "He won't be back for a week." "Then we need our own lawyer," Mary Henderson suggested. "Someone who knows land law." "With what money?" Stephen Kowalski asked bitterly. "Association has all wealth. We have only land they try to steal." The group fell silent, the weight of their situation pressing down. Then Ruth stood, an idea forming. "We don't need to match their wealth," she said. "We need to make their wealth irrelevant." "Oh," several voices asked at once. Ruth looked at each face around the fire. "By making this bigger than just us, the newspapers in Denver, San Francisco, they'd be very interested in a story about wealthy cattlemen stealing from honest homesteaders, about corruption reaching from Wyoming to Washington. The association owns the local paper," someone pointed out. "But not all papers," Ruth countered. "And I know how to write." My father taught me letters for his business correspondence. I can craft a story that will have every editorial writer from here to New York crying out for justice. Caleb smiled slowly. A different kind of ammunition. The most dangerous kind. Ruth agreed. The truth. The next days were a whirlwind of activity while the men continued building and maintaining defenses. Ruth wrote. She crafted letter after letter, each one telling their story in vivid, compelling detail. She wrote of families driven from their homes, of corrupted law enforcement, of the American dream perverted by greed. Emma Hartley proved invaluable, using her connections through the school to gather more stories, more evidence. Other women joined the effort, creating a network of information that stretched across the county. My grandmother would be proud, Mary Henderson said one evening as they worked. She wrote for the abolitionists before the war. Said the pen could break chains stronger than any iron. Ruth looked up from her latest letter. Ink staining her fingers. Let's hope she was right. On Saturday evening, as they prepared for the judge's arrival Monday, Caleb surprised Ruth with a small package wrapped in brown paper. What's this? She asked. Open it, he said, unusually shy. Inside was a simple gold band. Nothing fancy but perfectly sized for her finger. Ruth's breath caught. I know we're already married, Caleb said quietly. But you deserved a proper ring. I ordered it from Denver weeks ago before everything. It just arrived. Ruth slipped it on tears blurring her vision. It's perfect. He pulled her close and for a moment they could pretend they were just newlyweds, not leaders of a resistance against powerful forces. But the moment was shattered by the sound of approaching horses, many horses riding fast. They rushed outside to find chaos. Association riders, at least 20 of them, were scattering the neighbors' cattle, shooting in the air, creating panic. But these weren't the local toughs they'd faced before. These men moved with professional precision, their face cold and purposeful. The cannons, Caleb said grimly. They've arrived early. The defenders scrambled for positions. Ruth found herself at an upstairs window of the partially rebuilt house, rifle in hand. As riders circled below, she could hear Caleb shouting orders, the crack of gunfire, the screams of frightened horses. A rider broke from the group, charging straight for the house. Ruth tracked him with her rifle, waiting for the right moment when he raised his gun toward the window where Mary Henderson was stationed. Ruth fired. The man tumbled from his saddle, clutching his shoulder. Good shot, Mary called out. But there were too many of them and they were too well organized. The defenders were being pushed back, overwhelmed by superior numbers and firepower. Then, just as hope seemed lost, new gunfire erupted from the ridge. Ruth saw riders streaming down. Sheriff Bradley and his deputies, but also others, townsfolk who'd finally had enough. Led by none other than Thomas Hartley. For the valley, Hartley shouted, firing from horseback with surprising skill. The tide turned quickly, caught between two forces. The association guns retreated, leaving several wounded behind. As the dust settled, Ruth counted their own casualties. Injuries but no deaths. Thank God. Sheriff Bradley dismounted near Caleb. McBride sent a telegram. He's on his way back with federal marshals. And that judge from Cheyenne seems he had a sudden change of heart about coming to Wyoming. The letters? Ruth asked hopefully. Bradley grinned. Front page of the Denver Post yesterday. Cattle Baron's reign of terror, complete with names, dates, and that document Hartley provided. The governors ordered a full investigation. Relief flooded through Ruth, making her knees weak. Caleb's arm came around her, steady and strong. It's not over, he warned quietly. They'll regroup. Try again. Maybe. Ruth agreed. But not today and not here. We've shown them this valley won't break easily. As the sun set over the battlefield, their allies began gathering the scattered cattle, tending wounds, rebuilding what had been damaged. Ruth watched it all from the porch of their half-built home. Caleb beside her. I never meant for this, he said. When I hired a cook that night, I just wanted someone to make biscuits and keep to herself. Ruth laughed, the sound carrying across the valley. And I just wanted a job and a roof over my head. Life has a way of giving us what we need, not what we think we want. He turned to her, his eyes serious. I need you to know something. What I said that night during the storm about wanting more than a cook, I meant it even then. From the moment you stood in my yard, defiant and desperate and brave, I knew you were dangerous to my peace. And now, Ruth asked softly. Now I can't imagine peace without you in it, he said simply. She kissed him then, there on the porch with their neighbors and friends around them, with the evidence of battle still fresh and the future still uncertain. It was a kiss that said more than words, about survival and hope, about love forged in hardship, about two souls finding home in each other against all odds. When they broke apart, Emma Hartley was approaching with a bundle of letters. "Mrs. Morrison, these came on the afternoon stage, responses from the newspapers." Ruth opened them eagerly. Scanning the contents, the Rocky Mountain News wanted more information. The San Francisco Chronicle was sending a reporter. Harper's Weekly requested illustrations to accompany a feature story. "We did it," Ruth breathed. "We really did it." "You did it?" Caleb corrected. "You and your dangerous way with words." Thomas Hartley approached hesitantly. "Morrison, I know I have no right to ask, but would you consider letting me help? I know law. I have connections. I want to make amends." Caleb looked at Ruth, who nodded slightly. "Everyone deserves a chance at redemption. Mr. Hartley, welcome to the fight." As night fell, the Morrison Ranch resembled less a battlefield and more a celebration. Someone produced a fiddle, and soon music drifted across the prairie. Couples danced on the packed earth. Children played despite the late hour, and stories were shared around the fire. Ruth found herself pulled into a reel, passed from partner to partner until she was breathless with laughter. When she finally collapsed next to Caleb, he was watching her with an expression that made her heart skip. "What?" she asked. "Just thinking," he said, "about how you've brought life back to this place. Not just the ranch but the whole valley. People are hoping again, fighting again, living again. We brought it back." Ruth corrected. "Together." The party continued late into the night, but eventually families began drifting away to their own homes. Caleb and Ruth found themselves alone by the dying fire, the stars brilliant overhead. "She thought he hired her to cook," Ruth murmured, echoing the words from that night during the storm until the midnight rancher claimed he wanted much, much more. Caleb finished. "I meant it then and I mean it now. I want your laughter in my kitchen and your strength beside me. I want your clever words defending our neighbors and your steady aim defending our home. I want to build something here with you. Something that will last." Ruth leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. "Then we'll build it," she said simply. "Board by board, word by word, day by day, we'll build a life worth fighting for." The moon rose full and bright over the Wyoming plains, painting the landscape in silver and shadow. And there, amid the ashes of the old and the framework of the new, Ruth and Caleb Morrison sat together, no longer alone, no longer afraid, ready to face whatever tomorrow might bring. The ranch house would be rebuilt, stronger than before. The association would be held accountable for their crimes. The valley would prosper under the protection of law and the strength of community. But all of that was tomorrow's work. Tonight, there was only this, a man and woman who'd found each other in the midst of loss. Who'd chosen love over fear, who'd discovered that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the simplest words, "I need a cook." And if the coyotes howling in the distance sounded like celebration, well, perhaps they too understood that something fundamental had shifted in the valley. The age of might makes right was ending. The age of neighbors standing together, of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, of love conquering fear. That age was just beginning. Spring came early to Wyoming that year, painting the prairie in shades of green and gold. The Morrison Ranch, rebuilt stronger than before, stood as a testament to what determination and community could achieve. The new barn was larger than the old one, the house more solid, with proper shutters that could be barred against trouble and windows that caught the morning light just right. Ruth stood in her kitchen garden, now thriving with a neat rows of vegetables and herbs. She pressed a hand to the small swell of her belly, still barely noticeable beneath her apron, and smiled at the secret she'd share with Caleb tonight. The thought of his reaction, probably stunned silence followed by that rare, brilliant smile, made her heart flutter. "Mrs. Morrison," young Emma Hartley called from the gate. She'd become a regular visitor, helping Ruth with her correspondence and learning what she called the power of the pen. The stage brought newspapers from Denver. Ruth wiped her hands on her apron and went to meet her. The headlines were everything they'd hoped. Federal investigation reveals corruption in Wyoming Cattle Association and land rights restored to homesteaders. "Your words did this," Emma said admiringly. "Our words," Ruth corrected, "and the courage of people willing to stand up for what's right." The sound of horses drew their attention. Caleb rode in with the Kowalski brothers and Robert Henderson, all grinning broadly. They'd been to town for the final hearing on the land disputes. "It's over," Caleb announced, dismounting and sweeping Ruth into his arms. Mindful of propriety, but unable to contain his joy. "Judge ruled in our favor on all counts. The association's been dissolved, at least in this county. And Marshal McBride says 3 more of their hired guns are heading to federal prison." The men dispersed to share the news with their families, leaving Ruth and Caleb alone in the yard. He studied her face, his brow furrowing slightly. "You look different," he said. "There's something." Ruth took his hand and placed it on her stomach. We're building more than just a ranch. Caleb Morrison. The emotions that crossed his face, shock, joy, a touch of fear, and finally overwhelming love, were worth every moment of keeping the secret. He dropped to his knees right there in the yard, pressing his forehead to her belly. A child? He whispered. Our child, due in autumn, Ruth said, running her fingers through his hair. When the harvest comes in, he stood and kissed her deeply, not caring who might see. When they broke apart, his eyes were suspiciously bright. I never thought after Sarah. I never thought I'd have this chance again. Life gives second chances to those brave enough to take them, Ruth said softly. That evening they hosted a celebration dinner. The ranch house was full of neighbors who'd become friends, fellow fighters who'd become family. Thomas Hartley, now their legal advocate and a changed man, raised a toast. To the Morrisons, he said, who showed us that one ranch defending itself becomes a valley standing together. As the evening wore on and Ruth moved among their guests, she marveled at how much had changed. The woman who'd arrived at this gate months ago, desperate and alone, seemed like a stranger now that Ruth had been running from life. This Ruth was embracing it with both hands. Later, as the last guests departed and they sat on their porch in the moonlight, Caleb pulled her close. No regrets? He asked quietly. Ruth thought about the journey that had brought her here, the fever that took her family, the desperate flight west, the cold night she'd stood at his gate. All of it had led to this moment, this life, this love. How can I regret the path that brought me home? She answered. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars and listening to the night sounds of the prairie. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. But the sound no longer seemed threatening. It was simply part of the landscape they'd claimed, the life they'd built. I've been thinking, Caleb said eventually, about what you said months ago about not just surviving but living. And you were right. 3 years after Sarah died, I was just going through the motions, existing, not living. Then you arrived. And he paused, searching for words. You didn't just cook my meals and clean my house. You brought music back, laughter, hope. You made me remember why life is worth fighting for. Ruth turned in his arms to face him. You gave me purpose when I had none, a place to belong when I was lost. You taught me to shoot, to ride, to stand up for myself, but more than that, you showed me that opening your heart again after loss isn't betraying the past. It's honoring it by continuing to live. Sarah would have liked you, Caleb said after a moment. She was gentle where you're strong, quiet where you're fierce, but she had the same generous heart, the same way of seeing the best in people. Then I'm honored to follow in her footsteps. Ruth said simply, to love the man she loved, to protect the land she called home. As if by mutual agreement, they rose and walked through their house, their rebuilt, reinforced hard-won house, in the kitchen where Ruth had first proven herself with biscuits and strong coffee, past the parlor where they'd spent winter evenings. Boundaries slowly dissolving up the stairs where she'd fled that night after he'd kissed her palm. In their bedroom. Their bedroom now, not his. With her down the hall, Caleb lit the lamp while Ruth unpinned her hair. These simple domestic moments still felt miraculous to both of them, precious in their ordinariness. The baby will need a room, Ruth said, already planning. The babies, Caleb corrected with a grin. I don't intend to stop at one. Ruth laughed, the sound filling the room with warmth. Ambitious, aren't we? A man can dream, he said, pulling her close. And my dreams these days are all about the future we're building. Children running through that garden you've coaxed from the prairie. Teaching our sons to ride, our daughters to shoot, and to write letters that change the world. Our daughters will know they can be more than just cooks, Ruth said with mock severity. Unless they want to be cooks, Caleb countered, in which case they'll be the finest cooks in Wyoming, taught by the woman who tamed a bitter rancher with her biscuits. Is that the story you'll tell them? That I tamed you? No, he said seriously, I'll tell them the truth. That their mother was a brave woman who walked through darkness to find light. Who stood against powerful men with nothing but courage and conviction. Who showed an entire valley how to hope again, and who, despite all good sense, chose to love a haunted man and brought him back to life. Ruth felt tears slip down her cheeks. And I'll tell them about their father. A man who thought he'd lost everything but still had room in his heart for a desperate stranger. Who fought for justice even when it cost him dearly. Who taught me that strength isn't about standing alone. It's about knowing when to stand together. They held each other as the lamp burned low. Two souls who'd found salvation in the most unlikely place. Outside, the Wyoming night stretched endlessly, full of challenges yet to come. There would be droughts and hard winters, market crashes and new threats. The Cattlemen's Association might be broken in their county, but greed and power would always find new forms. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, there was only this, A man and woman building a life together on the bones of the prairie, writing their own story of love and loss and redemption. A story that began with a simple need for a cook and became something neither could have imagined. She thought he hired her to cook. Ruth murmured sleepily against Caleb's chest until the midnight rancher claimed he wanted much, much more. He completed, pressing a kiss to her hair, and got everything he never knew he needed. As sleep claimed them, the moon continued its journey across the vast Wyoming sky, blessing the valley with its silver light. And in the Morrison Ranch house, two hearts beat as one. Proof that sometimes the greatest adventures begin not with grand gestures, but with small acts of courage, like knocking on a stranger's door on a cold night or saying yes to an unexpected chance at love. Their story would be told for generations, growing in the telling as all good stories do. But at its heart would always be this simple truth that love, real love, is worth fighting for, worth rebuilding for, worth risking everything for. And that sometimes, just sometimes, the very thing we think we've lost forever is waiting just beyond the next ridge, ready to begin again. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I hope Ruth and Caleb's journey touched your heart as much as it touched mine. Where are you listening from today? I'd love to hear from cowboys and cowgirls all around the world. Please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. Did this story remind you of your own love story, or perhaps inspire you to take a chance on love? Let me know. I read every comment and love connecting with fellow Western romance enthusiasts.